and that was their base for a long time. And then they were attacked again and had to come down to Earth, and that was about 60,000 years ago, and they really started to mess up a lot of the genetic experiments that were going on. They went crazy, making chimera, mixing humans with animals, their DNA with humans, all of it. Now, the long-term program, all of the ETs out there were once experiments. They started off very raw and rudimentary. Their genetics were enhanced. Their consciousness was enhanced, and to a point to where they became self-managing. Now, most of these groups determine when they need a genetic upgrade, when they need a change in consciousness. And they become, one of the steps is that you become a interstellar species. Maybe 100 years from now, time is relative, of course, with space travel, somewhere at a local star, someone's going to sit down with an artist and describe an alien that abducted them, and it's going to look like you and me. We're going to be the ETs out there that are going to become a part of this, managing the experiment. Now, the upgrades in our genetics and consciousness are timed to coincide perfectly with this galactic cosmic change that occurs, with these energies that come in. They work with the cosmos in this ascension machine that we live on. Now, as I discussed earlier, to reach success, self-management, there has to be a perfect balance struck in the DNA, genetic, and spiritual consciousness component as we're developing. And we've suffered a lot from competing programs coming in and screwing around with our consciousness and our genetics. We should be much further along than we are. And before we can make it to the next level, we have to raise our consciousness or our vibration. We're seeing a lot of very strange solar activity, even though this is supposed to be the solar minimum. What is occurring can appear scary to many, many people. The ancient mystery teachings have all prepared these elite secret societies with the information I'm telling you about now, that what they call is a solar sneeze, which is the sun has a 360-degree full circumference mass coronal ejection. Just everything. All the surface of the earth expels, of the sun expels. And the entire sun becomes like a sunspot, dark. And for a certain amount of days, the sun will appear dark. And then it pops up in equilibrium again and is back in balance before it goes through the cycle again. And the huge population, this ascension event that's occurring, many of the souls are here because they know it's the time, and they're here to ride the wave of ascension. The solar sneeze is said to give more than 100,000 years of evolution in less than 1,000 years. Now, Bridget Nielsen, I think she's in here, coined a phrase recently that I love. We came here as star seeds, but now is the time that we become star blossoms. This is a time everyone, I've never seen star seeds so excited about their mission. All of us are blossoming and coming into our mission, and we're finding that all of our missions link together. Now, how many people think that the head of the UN is going to come up to a microphone and tell us aliens exist? Nobody. Not one hand went up. When we do get disclosure, full disclosure, it's not going to be a kumbaya moment. Everyone in this room is not going to hold hands and start singing and cry and being excited. It's going to be a traumatic, very traumatic moment for humanity. Because full disclosure, it's not about are there ETs. It also encompasses all the information about the crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated on us to keep the secret. as well as information about this galactic slave trade, where over 1 million people a year are taken off planet. At the age of 16, almost 17, when I was completed with the MyLab training, I was what they call drafted into the Navy's secret space program. I was taken to the Lunar Operation Command for processing. Even though I was under 17, they had me sign a bunch of documents, gave me medical exams, all these injections. Nobody told me what they were. They just walked up, gave you injections. You were not entitled to know what they were. Now, I mentioned the jobs. They would take them up to one of the interrogation stations and try to find out why they're here. What's their agenda? Because there is a process that these beings can come down and get approval to live amongst us and study us. And of course, the Lunar Operation Command is basically air traffic control. When any type of craft comes into our solar system, they have to provide a friend or foe signal. They have to tell us their intent. Back before we had developed out our own space program, these groups were coming in, scooping up humans and leaving. And after we developed our own secret space program, we were able to repel these people. But of course, the negative humans decided that this slave trade was a good commodity, and they started trading off, like I said, 1 million humans off the planet every year for technologies and biological samples from other star systems. I already covered this. Now, this is a recent representation of the vessel I was assigned to. The security, the military people, they did not want to be assigned to the research vessels. There was no action there. It's very boring. And they would, for a derogatory statement, they would call the ship a hot dog because it slightly resembles, in America, a hot dog, where they put like a sausage in a bun. Solar Warden has gone through a few different names since the 90s. I don't know what the current name is, but Solar Warden was the Navy's first program name for the secret space program. Now, these vessels are basically submarines that have been fitted. In the beginning, they used submarines retrofitted with torsion field engines, and then they developed them out further to have 8 fleets. And these ships are traveling to other solar systems, and these vessels are dedicated to scientific research. Here's some other views. These are very close representations. The name of my craft was the Arnold Sommerfeld. He was a German scientist that was a theoretical physicist whose ideas really fed into a lot of the new quantum physics theories. The ship from the middle would come apart. All of the inside was modular. It would pull out. You could change it to a troop transport craft, to a hospital craft, scientific research craft, whatever you needed, by changing out modules inside the craft. Now, I worked mostly with what we call the eggheads. They were the scientists and the engineers. And they were very mundane activities. I was helping break down and set up rooms for experiments. I assisted in monitoring experiments. They did what, I'm trying to remember the name of the training, redundancy training. We would have to train along with other people on the ship to get a general idea of their duties so that we could perform them in the time of an emergency. And because it was so boring, it really was boring, I spent a lot of time on the smart glass pads accessing the human database of information. Some of these cigar vessels were 2 kilometers long. They were built both in Antarctica and in Utah, underground. There is a huge shipbuilding facility. Now, most of the engineers that I worked with stated that when the craft were about 60% completed, they moved in and lived on the craft for the rest of the build-out. And they assisted with the build-out and would know the ships intimately for engineering. Now, a smart glass pad, if you were to find one laying here on the ground, it would look like just a piece of plexiglass, unremarkable, with a little metal strip on the side, a little bit of internal wiring, very, very small, barely able to see. And it had historical information on it that would be displayed. You neurologically interfaced with it. When it touched your fingertips, it would be clear. And once you learned how to activate it mentally, it would turn opaque or kind of white. And then you'd begin to start seeing data in whatever language was your native language, as well as not exactly holographic coming off the device, but very rich three-dimensional images and scenes. Have all of you heard of William Tompkins? He recently passed on while actually on the day of the eclipse. He actually was most likely involved in debriefing the the spies that went to Germany to find out about their secret space program during World War II. A lot of the information he was able to gather was on the smart glass pads. Imagine me, I was looking at all this information on the smart glass pads, and then I get to meet the guy who was debriefing people who put the information in. It was very interesting. We had some very interesting conversations. There were a few more I would love to have had with him. This is when he was working for the one of the, I'm trying to remember, was it Northrop Grumman? I can't remember which of these companies he was working for at the time, but they had him design a new type of naval spacecraft. And indeed, I ended up seeing these. They look very much like the stealth ships that the United States is using today. These are flying over our heads at this very moment. Very big, very big. Larger than aircraft carriers. The history of the secret space program. Now everyone knows that Nikola Tesla was way ahead of his time. He actually discovered the true model of the universe. It's an electroplasmic universe, and also torsion. The whole universe is a giant torsion bubble. Upon his death, all of his information was removed from his safe, but very few people know that John G. Trump, President Trump's uncle, was the one who removed all of this information and studied it. So most likely Trump grew up hearing stories about free energy and about space travel. Recently, when Trump entered office, he signed a secret memorandum requiring that there are over 8,000 classified patents. He ordered a large number of them to be declassified. The Department of Energy is the main group that watches over these patents. And they told him it would take 10 years at least to get everything ready. And he said, no, do it now. Do it now. And there's pushback. They're not wanting to release the information for obvious reasons. Victor Schauberger was basically the father of torsion field physics here on our planet. He met Hitler in 1934, and then he was forced, just like most of the secret space program development, it's mostly been built out by slaves. slave labor, and he became one. Now, Maria Orsic from the Vril Society, she was doing experiments with her group. Now, they ended up getting in contact with more of a positive group that did not have the agenda of the Nazis. Admiral Byrd in Operation High Jump in 1947 was sent down to Antarctica to locate and destroy the last remaining Nazis. We knew that they were down there. We knew that they were in Argentina. We knew that they were in the Ross Ice Shelf region of Antarctica. And we went there with our conventional weapons. We won World War II, supposedly, so we thought we were going to take them out. And the official story was that we were testing cold weather machinery, how the machines acted in cold weather, how soldiers acted in cold weather, but it was actually a military invasive program. And of course, in 1952, the spacecraft that flew over Washington, those were manned by Germans. The Germans learned very quickly that the highest secret in the land was the existence of ETs. And it's not because they don't think we can handle that ETs are out there. That's BS. That's what they tell us. You can't handle the truth. The real reason is because they know that we'll start asking, how did they get here? And then they have to release free energy. And of course we know that that's how they control the planet. And they don't want to lose control. This is what the Lunar Operation Command looked like at the end of my time there. It originally was built into a swastika by the Germans, and then we built it out. Here's an animation. There was a protrusion in the middle of the crater that was a hole that went down underneath, and only part of the base is above ground. The rest is underground, and it's built out in the shape of a bell. It gets wider and wider. And there are at least 11 levels. I was not granted access. And they have, it's on the dark side of the moon at about the 10 o'clock position. And they use cloaking and shielding devices to where if a satellite went over, it would just see a mirage. This is the DART, which would come in my backyard and pick me up. My wife, when I first started telling her about it, thought I was a little crazy. And she used to smoke, and she would go out in the backyard, and she would see points to where 3 points of the craft had landed. And, you know, she could explain that off in her mind. But then one day she went out and found my bare footprints going out into the yard. You'll see in a minute, it was mostly mud. It wasn't all grass. And then my footprints disappeared. And then they began again, like 10, 20 feet later, going back to the house. That's what really got her attention. This was my backyard at the time. And this is where they would fly in through the trees and land. Right here. There's my dog. Now, they brought me up to the Lunar Operation Command, the first time I'd been there in decades. And like I said, it had built out. They brought me into a conference room that looked like any college, any university. And I was standing there, and these two beings appeared behind me, and the blue aliens started using me to answer the questions for a full audience of military and civilian government-type people. Now, the Nazis and all of these military-industrial complex groups formed what is called the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. There's an infrastructure in space built out that is huge. The reason they wanted to take over America was that we were building 10 tanks for every one of theirs. We had this huge industrial might. They needed that to build out the infrastructure of space, and they got it. A lot of y'all have heard of the Haunebu, the spacecraft that the Germans had. The nickname for it was the honeybee. They called it the honeybee in the programs. And there were over a dozen different type of craft they had. The ICC secured places on the moon by using I don't think it's fifth generation, a different type of tactical nukes that were basically vacuum. They would blow out and suck in, and most of the damage was occurred in that way. And it was very similar to how they took over, North, South America during, the discovery of America. But they did want to make sure that it is completely locked down on Mars. It's a major slave colony. They do not want a 13 colonies situation to occur, and they're preventing it. There's no way that they can break away and become free like America supposedly did. In the portal systems, they can in the beginning they could only transport raw materials, and a lot of you have probably seen Stargate Atlantis or Stargate, where there's a flat, like liquid kind of thing that they walk through in a circle. That's not how the portals work. The portals, they have devices, 3 or 4 devices on each side of the room, and in the middle of the room, a ball appears that looks like a mirage above the road when it's hot, and it looks like the ground looks like it's being pushed down or warped. And you can enter it from 360 degrees around. People will walk in, and they look like they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller as they go in. They would send like metal beams for building. The portal would open up in the middle of the metal beam, and it would look like spaghetti. The beams would go bend and suck in. Here's the cosmic web. Each star, each galaxy is connected by an electromagnetic filament. Those are the traversable routes of wormholes. And of course, slave labor is used exclusively in building out these bases. The first bases were built out successfully in the 1950s. The Germans had a lot of difficulties. In the area of Mars, they were building out bases at first. There were huge dust storms that caused major electrostatic discharges that was destroying all of their equipment. It was only within a certain region of the North and South Pole that they found that they could have the technologies before they were able to shield them that wouldn't be affected by these storms. And a lot of these people in the beginning came from the brain drain era and were brought in to programs with big promises, sort of like what Laura Eisenhower, they tried to feed her, but she was wise enough to say no. Many were not. They were told, you will live like the Jetsons. And they showed them videos of underground bases here that the elite live in, and they said, this is how you're going to live. So people said, of course, I'll do this. But the reality is, this is how they ended up living. When they arrived, they were treated like cattle. They were told their children would be trained in whatever job they wanted them to. They would be married off to whoever they thought would most be genetically compatible with them. They were prisoners. And of course, we are building on Mars craft that over 900 ETs are coming here to trade for. If you see a UFO and an ET is in it, there's a good chance that humans built it for them. It sounds very strange, but we are very excellent engineers. That's one of the reasons that they abduct us. And on Mars, there were these different beings that were there. There was a humanoid race that had a slightly red skin and or almost black eyes, reptilians, and insectoids. And the Nazis, they, along with the crates they brought with them, they brought pests, cockroaches, rats, spiders, that because of the environment and the radiation, they grew to tremendous sizes. On the planet, there were already life. There were these giant burrowing worms that went underground, and there were these strange little animals that were kind of like bats. So we couldn't understand how they flew really because the barometric pressure was so low, but every time their wings would flap, they would do a little peep, peep, peep as they would take off. And they lived in these bushes, in these colonies of bushes. And of course, everyone's seen the signs of ancient civilization on Mars. This is nothing new. And the fact that on the surface of Mars, every day, water leaches onto the surface, it freezes, it thaws. There's plenty of water on Mars. This is a good representation of what the skies really look. This is more at dusk. They put red filters on NASA to make us think that everything's red, but at times the sky is red because of the dust, the huge sandstorms. And there are aurora borealises that occur at times all over the planet, not just at the poles, and they're magnificent. And Buzz Aldrin recently spoke about the Phobos moon and the strange anomaly there. And this is going to be the part that I really wanted to talk about. I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of time. We have a Mayan group. Their technology is basically magic. Yeah, they interface with stones with their consciousness. And they have craft that are made entirely out of stone. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip through this quickly. Now, here are the raptors. I described them earlier. They're a remnant of the dinosaurs. They're very bird-like. Bird-like movements. I had covered this. Of course, the reptilians. There are many types of reptilians. The reptoid ones are often mistaken for grays, and they claim to be the original inhabitants of our planet. The Draco Royals are white, 14 foot tall, very invasive in their communications telepathically. And they control the joint underground bases. Ambassador Mika was someone I recently met. His planet had recently, in the last 300 years, been liberated from the reptilians and had gone through their own ascension or consciousness renaissance process. And they're going to be here to assist us. We're going to be seeing a lot of these people. These are the Anshar, an inner Earth group that we recently found. They claim to have come here 17 million years ago. And it turns out that they're from the future. They're us from the future. And they had been monitoring some sort of strange Mandela effect sort of anomaly occurring. And they sent a small group back in time 17 million years ago to maintain their timeline. And that small group has turned into a huge civilization that lives underground over that 17 million years. This is Kari, the priestess, who I interfaced with. She's over 130 years old. These people were also at the meeting, a very tall Asian-looking group who had crystals implanted under their foreheads, under the skin, and a very Indian-looking group that had, they didn't look quite that blue, but you know how the color of your vein under your skin, all of their body was that color. And there was a very African-looking group that had these hourglass symbols that were present. They had a very powerful presence, very strong energy. And of course, the different Anshar, they have a race that is very pale, has white hair, and then they also have some that are a part of their race that have blonde hair and dark hair. There's this one group that wears a silver star pendant, and they're very Mediterranean or Greek kind of looking. I was brought down to this location to where it was a religious area for the Anshar. I had to go through a cleansing ceremony, met these people. I was brought to a meeting. This is a depiction of the meeting, that all of the previous groups I showed were there. I was then brought into this large cavern to where their city is. And then I saw the city. There were saucers, cigars, and egg-shaped craft flying around at the top, and they were going through the walls. Take a look at this. This is very similar. All deep within the earth. They had an underground cavern that was basically a huge hydroponic system. The light, there was no source of light. When I asked where the light was coming from, she said it was produced by sound. And then they had a huge wildlife preserve with all kinds of prehistoric animals. An obelisk in the middle that above it had a huge ball, a plasma ball that fed light. Next, I was brought to the library. When I appeared in the library, there was a large golden arm coming down with a crystal ball in the hand. And then I was walked through the library. And I saw ancient manuscripts, and I saw books with ISBN numbers that looked like they were ordered online that they had. They had lost access to the crystal caverns because the raptors took it over, but they did have a huge crystal that they were trying to regenerate in some sort of a pressurized container room. Of course, when I interfaced with Kari, we went hand to hand and we did a mind meld where we found out everything about each other. And of course, my diet changed. When I first started shooting Cosmic Disclosure, I was 268 pounds, and the diet changed. Now I'm 185. It happened very quickly. They walked me through an area where there were hundreds of Anshar in these floating egg-type chairs, and they were interfacing with us on the surface while we were meditating, while we were dreaming. And they were trying to give us information. And eventually they took me to Antarctica in one of their the bus craft. It looks very much like a bus on the inside. And I was taken underwater to see these huge underwater caverns. The objects down there are submarines that are electromagnetically propelled that are the size of container ships. I actually saw them opened up in cranes emptying out containers. And recently in the news, we've seen that this type of stuff does exist under the ice. Volcanism melts the ice and creates a very warm, like 20 degrees Celsius area. This is very similar. They use geothermal energy. And of course, they were using steam to excavate a lot of the ruins that they were finding, pressurized steam. And when I would enter and leave with the Anshar and craft, we would enter through this blue portal that was over the ocean. And I'm not going to have time to get into the Banished. They're a group of inner Earth people that were cast out and live on the Earth. I had a experience with one of them. They were very much, it was a succubus type of experience. They seek positions of power, and they actually have children with surface humans, which is very forbidden. After my experience with this woman who was one of the Banished, I was brought in, and Kari told me that she had infected me with entity attachments, and she used a long crystal that when she rubbed it, it started singing, kind of like when you rub your fingers on a glass with water in it. And she waved it above me, and all the entities left. And then eventually this is when they took me to the location to where there was a library, an ancient pre-Adamite library that they took us to. We took core samples off of these bodies. It was not a very pleasant thing to get genetic information. And not far from us was an active excavation region where they were using pressurized steam to excavate the ice. And this is where we took core samples out of the bodies, the DNA samples. And they jokingly called it the Pompeii on ice, the way they found the bodies. It was very similar. And one of the things that I saw was a human being with a tail. Part of their genetic experiments.
Sorry, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. This is what the pre-Adamites look like with the elongated skulls. Very similar to what we've seen in Egypt. This is what they look like. Very weird rib cages pushed in, pot bellies, and all the men, they had kind of like a flabby chest. fat up here. Very similar to the depictions here. And of course, when I was with the Anshar, they completely walked through the wall to go into this library where they removed a number of scrolls. And recently the Anshar have told me that ET and contact from these beings, a lot of us are like, how come we're not getting contacted? How come no one's contacting me? Well, these beings, they have to approach us through our higher self. Our higher self determines if we get contact, what type of contact we will get. And it also tells them what they need to give us to prepare us for contact. And it all comes down through the higher self. It's very much different than the way I thought it was. And the Anshar have recently evacuated their city. All of the buildings, there's nothing but footprint now. They all went into this temporal anomaly, very much like what I showed you earlier with the Federation base. And they're doing that as a protective reason because of these energies coming in. And of course, we've seen on the news exactly what I've been talking about since February, about the areas under the ice that are 20 degrees Celsius. You could go with a t-shirt. You can go, in some of these places, you can go swimming. And the biggest secret is not, they want us to talk about these ancient civilizations. They do not want us talking about the research and development bases that they built during Project Iceworm during the 1960s. This is also how they built a lot of bases on other planets. I don't have time to show this whole video. Make a note to look for Project Iceworm on the internet, and please watch that video. It'll give you a lot of insight on how these bases are built and maintained. And of course, they have every story you've heard at Dulce about genetic engineering, about all these horrible slaves and stuff. All of that is going on in Antarctica. And it is against the treaty that was signed that stated it was for peaceful purposes only. So this is the big thing that is the Achilles heel of the cabal. They do not want us talking about this. So I'm going to talk about it more. The Navy and the Air Force have competing programs. They're compartmentalized. They don't know about them. We've been seeded through movies and television about the existence of these programs subconsciously. This is what the bases, the stations look like that the Air Force has that are about 500 miles above the surface of the Earth. They're serviced by these triangular craft that go up to them daily, dock, and then come back down. We also have a lot of smaller stations.
The last minute, please.
Okay, I'm going to wind it down. A lot of this was built during this Star Wars SDI program with President Reagan. And what we want is not a partial disclosure, them giving us little bits for us to chew on. We want full disclosure. Like I said, it's going to be traumatic, but we deserve it. We need it to fully grow. There's too much being kept from us. Every legitimate ET contact that has occurred since the 1950s, they've basically said two things. Demand the release of suppressed technologies and raise your consciousness, become more spiritual. Well, that's what all of our goals are. And we can put aside all of our different UFO belief systems, our UFO religions, we all have. We have to put those aside and work together to co-create a future with full disclosure. Only through uniting this community are we going to be able to do that. And recently, the Rothschilds tried to start a civil war in the ufology community that failed. So we need to come together and start to do protests, mass meditations, organize. We've got to do this. You can go to the fulldisclosureproject.org and join in, form your own groups, please. And together, we're going to be able to navigate to the most optimal temporal reality. And our co-creative consciousness is what is going to do it. It's not going to be any outside force. The biggest thing the Blue Avians have told us, we don't need any more belief systems. We don't need any more religions. We need to get off of our knees, quit looking at the skies for salvation, and look inwardly, because we are the ones that we've been waiting for. We've just been suppressed. And if you go to cosmiccocreation.com, I'm working with Gerald O'Donnell on a program to help us develop our meditative abilities and the mass consciousness. This is the book that I wrote, that I co-wrote with William Tompkins, Dr. Sala, and Dr. Wood, that should be released very soon. It should have some very interesting information that they don't want us to put out. And of course, secretspaceprogram.com we recently obtained. This is one place where we can all come together and begin to organize. And of course, if you want to watch Cosmic Disclosure, you go to blueavians.com. You can watch it for free, as I stated before. And that's the end. Gaia is hiring. They need a lot of these types of skills. If you feel like you're called to use your skills for this cause, you can do it with Gaia. You can do it with your own group. You can work together with us. But it's time that we come together.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.